Hello, and welcome to Nighttime Biographies. On the 8th of September 2022, in the drawing room of a castle nestled in the Scottish Highlands, a woman lay dying. She was 96 years old. Outside, the heather bloomed purple across the moorland, stretching toward distant mountains. The River Dee flowed through the valley below, its waters the same as they had been when she first came here as a child nearly 90 years before. Inside Balmoral Castle, in a room she'd known and loved her entire life, Queen Elizabeth II drew her last breaths. The family had gathered. Her eldest son Charles had arrived by helicopter that morning from his nearby estate at Birkhall. Her only daughter Anne, the Princess Royal, had been staying at Balmoral already, spending time with her mother in these final days. The other children, Andrew and Edward, were racing north, along with William, the eldest grandson. They would arrive too late. In those last hours, it was Charles and Anne who kept vigil. The woman in the bed had ruled longer than any British monarch in history. 70 years and 214 days. She had known 15 prime ministers, from Winston Churchill to Liz Truss. She had met 12 United States presidents, beginning with Harry Truman. She had outlived Stalin and Mao, seen empires fall and new nations rise, witnessed humanity walk on the moon and the invention of the internet. She had been queen when barely a quarter of the world's population had electricity. She was still queen in an age when everyone carried supercomputers in their pockets. At 3:10 in the afternoon, her heart stopped. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor, Queen of the United Kingdom, and 14 other Commonwealth realms, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith, died peacefully at Balmoral Castle. The woman who should never have been queen, who had ascended to the throne at 25 and promised to serve her entire life, had kept that promise to the very end. But to understand how a young princess became the longest reigning monarch in British history, how she guided the monarchy through the most tumultuous century in human history, and how she became the very embodiment of duty and service, we must go back to a townhouse in London on a spring morning in 1926, when no one expected the baby about to be born to ever wear the crown. Before we begin this journey through nearly a century of history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It is a simple gesture that means a great deal to me and helps bring stories like this to more people. I'm always curious to know where in the world you're watching from tonight, so please leave a comment and tell me your location. Now settle in. Let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let us travel back to the London of the 1920s, to a world of gaslight and horse-drawn carriages giving way to electricity and motor cars, to an empire that still painted the map pink, to a royal family trying to navigate the aftermath of a war that had shattered the old order forever. The world into which she was born. London in 1926 was the capital of the greatest empire the world had ever known. The British Empire covered nearly a quarter of the Earth's surface and ruled over 400 million people. From Canada to India, from Australia to Kenya, the Union Jack flew over territories spanning every continent. King George V sat on the throne, a stern and dutiful monarch who had guided Britain through the Great War and the transition from the Victorian age into the modern era. But the world was changing. The war that ended in 1918 had killed nearly 1 million British soldiers and civilians. The old certainties were crumbling. Ireland had won its independence after bloody conflict. The Russian Empire had fallen to revolution. The Ottoman Empire had collapsed. Across Europe, monarchies were toppling. The British royal family itself had changed its name, during the war abandoning the Germanic Saxe-Coburg-Gotha for the more English-sounding Windsor, desperate to distance themselves from their German cousins. Britain in 1926 was a nation still recovering from war, grappling with economic depression and facing labour unrest. The general strike that began in May of that year saw millions of workers walk off their jobs, bringing the country nearly to a standstill. Social class divisions ran deep. The wealthy still lived in grand townhouses with staffs of servants, while the working classes crowded into tenements without indoor plumbing. It was a society in transition, the old Victorian order giving way reluctantly to something new. Into this world, into the heart of London's Mayfair district, on the 21st of April 1926, at 20 minutes to 3 in the morning, a baby girl was born. The birth took place not in a palace, but in a townhouse at 17 Bruton Street, the London home of the baby's maternal grandparents, the Earl and Countess of Strathmore. The delivery was by caesarean section, performed by Sir Henry Simpson, the royal obstetrician. It was a healthy baby, weighing 7 pounds and 14 ounces. The baby's mother was Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the Duchess of York, aged 25. She was the youngest daughter of a Scottish aristocrat, a woman known for her warmth and charm, her ready smile, and her genuine connection with ordinary people. She had married Prince Albert, the Duke of York, 3 years earlier in a love match that had surprised and delighted the public. The baby's father was Prince Albert Frederick Arthur George, the Duke of York, aged 30. He was the second son of King George V and Queen Mary. Albert, known in the family as Bertie, was a shy, reserved man who suffered from a pronounced stammer that made public speaking torture for him. He had never expected to be anything more than a supporting player in the royal drama, The Spare to the Heir, living quietly in his older brother's shadow. The baby girl was christened Elizabeth Alexandra Mary on the 29th of May in the private chapel at Buckingham Palace. Elizabeth for her mother, Alexandra for her great-grandmother Queen Alexandra, who had died the year before, Mary for her paternal grandmother Queen Mary. The names carried weight, connecting this child to the long line of British queens who had come before. At the time of her birth, the baby Princess Elizabeth stood third in line to the throne. Her grandfather, King George V, was a healthy man in his early 60s. Her uncle, Edward, the Prince of Wales, was first in line, a charismatic bachelor of 31 who seemed destined to marry and produce heirs. Her father, the Duke of York, was second in line. The likelihood of this baby girl ever becoming queen seemed remote. She would live a life of royal privilege and duty, certainly, but she would likely spend her life in the comfortable anonymity enjoyed by younger members of the royal family. No one imagined that this child would one day be the most famous woman in the world. The York family, the household into which Princess Elizabeth was born, was loving but not grand. The Duke and Duchess of York lived modestly by royal standards. Their London home was 145 Piccadilly, a spacious townhouse near Hyde Park Corner. It was comfortable but not palatial, a home rather than a showplace. They also had the Royal Lodge in Windsor Great Park as their country residence, a pink-washed house with gardens where the family could escape the city. The Yorks were building a different kind of royal family. The Duchess of York, who would later be known to the world as the Queen Mother, believed in a more informal approach to child-rearing than had been traditional in royal circles. She wanted her daughters, for there would be another Princess Margaret born in 1930, to have as normal a childhood as possible within the constraints of their position. The family of 4 would become known as Us 4, a tight-knit unit that faced the world together. Elizabeth's early years were spent in a world of nannies and nurseries, but also of genuine parental affection. Her primary caregiver was Clara Knight, known as Arla, who had also cared for the Duchess of York in her own childhood. Later, Margaret MacDonald, called Bobo, would become Elizabeth's personal maid and closest servant, a relationship that would last until Bobo's death in 1993. Princess Elizabeth was by all accounts a serious child. orderly and responsible even as a toddler. Winston Churchill, meeting her when she was 2, described her as having an air of authority and reflectiveness, astonishing in an infant. Her cousin, Margaret Rhodes, would later recall her as a jolly little girl, but fundamentally sensible and well-behaved. She was not a rebel or a troublemaker. Even as a young child, she seemed to understand that she had a role to play. The first major separation came early, in January 1927, when Elizabeth was just 8 months old. Her parents embarked on a 6-month tour of Australia and New Zealand. The baby was left in the care of her nanny and her grandparents. King George V and Queen Mary were immediately enchanted by their granddaughter. The king, stern and formal with adults, would play with little Elizabeth on the floor of his study. The bond formed during the separation would remain strong throughout Elizabeth's childhood. The family divided their time between London and their various royal residences. Summers meant Balmoral Castle in Scotland, the Highland retreat that Queen Victoria had built and that every British monarch since had loved. Christmas and winter weekends took them to Sandringham House in Norfolk, the sprawling country estate with its farms and forests. Elizabeth would spend time at Windsor Castle with her grandparents, learning the routines and rhythms of royal life. In 1930, when Elizabeth was 4 years old, her sister, Margaret Rose, was born. The two girls would be close throughout their childhood, though their personalities were quite different. Margaret was vivacious, theatrical, rebellious. Elizabeth was serious, dutiful, responsible. But the four of them, mother, father, and 2 daughters, formed a happy and stable family unit. The Duke of York called them Us Four, and they delighted in their time together away from official duties. For Elizabeth's 6th birthday in 1932, the people of Wales gave her a special gift, We Bwthyn Bach, meaning the little cottage in Welsh. It was a miniature house, a playhouse of extraordinary detail, built to 2/3 scale. It had electric lights, running water, a working kitchen with china and utensils, bedrooms with linen, even books on the shelves. Elizabeth and Margaret would play house there for hours, learning domestic skills that would have been considered unsuitable for royal children a generation before. These early years were sheltered and privileged, but also genuinely happy. The Duchess of York was determined that her daughters would know joy and laughter, not just duty and protocol. There were riding lessons and swimming lessons, games in the garden, teas with friends. It was as close to a normal childhood as 2 princesses could have. But in 1936, everything changed. The abdication. On the 20th of January 1936, King George V died at Sandringham House. He was 70 years old and had been failing for some time. His last words, or so it was reported, were, "God damn you," spoken to his doctor, who had hastened the end with a lethal injection to ensure the king's death would make the morning papers rather than the evening ones. His death marked the end of an era. His eldest son was proclaimed King Edward VIII. The new king was handsome, charming, immensely popular with the public. At 41, he was still unmarried, though his love life had been the subject of much gossip. The court expected him to now settle down and marry appropriately. Princess Elizabeth, now 9 years old, was bumped up to second in the line of succession behind her uncle. But King Edward VIII had other plans. He was in love with Wallis Simpson, an American woman who had been married twice and divorced once, with a second divorce pending. The British establishment was horrified. The king, as Supreme Governor of the Church of England, could not marry a divorced woman. The government, led by Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, would not support the marriage. The choice was stark. Give up Mrs. Simpson or give up the throne. Edward chose Mrs. Simpson. On the 11th of December 1936, less than a year after becoming king, he abdicated. He gave a radio address to the nation, explaining that he found it impossible to carry on without the woman he loved by his side. Then he left England, eventually marrying Wallis and living out his life in exile as the Duke of Windsor. The crown passed to Edward's younger brother, the man who had never expected or wanted to be king. Prince Albert, Duke of York, became King George VI, and his 10-year-old daughter Elizabeth became heir presumptive to the throne. The family was shattered by the abdication. The new King George VI was 41 years old, shy, suffering from a terrible stammer, utterly unprepared for the burden thrust upon him. The Duchess of York, now Queen Elizabeth, was furious at her brother-in-law for abandoning his duty and leaving her husband to pick up the pieces. The two princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, had to leave their beloved home at 145 Piccadilly and move into the vast draughty Buckingham Palace. For Elizabeth, the change was profound. She was now heir to the throne. Barring the birth of a son to her parents, which became increasingly unlikely as her father aged, she would one day be queen. Her education, her training, her entire life would now be oriented toward that destiny. The carefree days of childhood were over. The education of a future queen. Elizabeth's education was unconventional by modern standards, though typical for royal and aristocratic girls of her generation. She never attended school. Instead, she was educated at home by governesses and tutors under the supervision of her mother and grandmother. The primary governess was Marion Crawford, a Scotswoman known as Crawfie. Crawfie had been hired when Elizabeth was 6 and would remain with the family for 17 years. She taught the princesses reading, writing, arithmetic, grammar, literature, history and geography. The curriculum was designed to produce well-rounded young ladies, not scholars. There was little emphasis on mathematics or sciences. The focus was on history, particularly British and European history, languages, art and music. Elizabeth showed herself to be a diligent student, perhaps not brilliant, but thorough and conscientious. She learned French from a series of French and Belgian governesses, a skill that would serve her well throughout her reign. She studied art and music, learning to play the piano. She became an excellent horsewoman, riding from a young age and developing a love of horses that would be a passion throughout her life. She also became a strong swimmer. At the age of 11, she enrolled as a Girl Guide, the British equivalent of Girl Scouts. Later, she became a Sea Ranger. These organisations gave her some contact with girls outside the royal circle, though even then, a special company was formed at Buckingham Palace to accommodate the security needs of having a princess participate. After her father became king, Queen Mary took a more active role in Elizabeth's education. The stern old queen believed her granddaughter needed to understand constitutional history, the role of Parliament, the delicate balance between the monarchy and the government. She arranged for C.H.K. Martin, the Vice Provost of Eton College, to tutor Elizabeth in history and constitutional law. Twice a week, Elizabeth would study with him, learning about the British Constitution, the role of the sovereign, the history of the monarchy. Martin treated the teenage princess as a serious student. He assigned her readings, essays, examinations. He taught her about the unwritten conventions that governed British political life, the way the monarchy had evolved from absolute power to constitutional symbolism. He impressed upon her that the sovereign had duties and responsibilities, that the crown was a burden as much as an honour. These lessons would shape Elizabeth's understanding of her future role. But Elizabeth's education extended beyond books. She learned by watching her father. King George VI was a dutiful monarch who took his responsibilities seriously. Despite his stammer and his natural shyness, he forced himself to carry out the endless round of public duties, the speeches, the ceremonies, the meetings with ministers and officials. He showed Elizabeth that duty came before personal comfort. that service was what the crown demanded. The king also ensured that Elizabeth understood the Commonwealth. The British Empire was transforming into a voluntary association of independent nations, united by common bonds of history and affection for the crown. Elizabeth would need to understand this new relationship, to value these nations as partners rather than possessions. Her father's coronation in 1937 had included representatives from across the empire, a symbolic recognition of the family of nations. As war approached, Elizabeth's education took on new urgency. She was learning to be queen, though everyone hoped that day was far in the future. The Second World War. On the 3rd of September 1939, Britain declared war on Nazi Germany. Elizabeth was 13 years old. The world she'd known was about to disappear into 6 years of total war. The royal family faced a difficult question. Should the princesses be evacuated to safety in Canada? Many aristocratic families were sending their children overseas, out of reach of German bombs and a possible invasion. The Queen was adamant. "The children won't go without me. I won't leave the king, and the king will never leave." The family would stay together, would share the dangers faced by ordinary Britons. For safety, the two princesses were sent to Windsor Castle, the great medieval fortress 20 miles west of London. They would spend most of the war years there, away from their parents who remained in London at Buckingham Palace. The king and queen would visit when they could, but duty kept them in the capital, touring bombed neighbourhoods, visiting factories, meeting with Churchill and the War Cabinet. At Windsor, Elizabeth and Margaret continued their education, but now under wartime conditions. They participated in air raid drills, rushing to the shelters when the sirens wailed. They were subject to rationing like everyone else, limited. Portions of meat, sugar, butter. They grew vegetables in the castle gardens as part of the Dig for Victory campaign. The massive castle, usually filled with servants and courtiers, was reduced to a skeleton staff. In October 1940, at the age of 14, Elizabeth made her first radio broadcast. Speaking to the children of Britain and the Commonwealth, many of whom had been evacuated from their homes, she said, "We know, every one of us, that in the end all will be well, for God will care for us and give us victory and peace." Her voice was clear and confident, with none of her father's stammer. Already she was learning to be a public figure. As she grew older, Elizabeth pressed to be allowed to contribute to the war effort. She wanted to serve, not simply wait out the war in safety. In 1942, when she turned 16, her father made her an honorary colonel of the Grenadier Guards. It was a largely ceremonial role, but it gave her some connection to the military. In 1945, in the final months of the war, Elizabeth finally got her wish. She joined the Women's Auxiliary Territorial Service, the women's branch of the British Army. She trained as a driver and mechanic, learning to drive heavy trucks, to change tyres, to repair engines. Photographs from the time show her in uniform, sleeves rolled up, hands greasy, changing a tyre on a military vehicle. She was known as Second Subaltern Elizabeth Windsor, number 23873. For a few months, she experienced something close to normal life, working alongside other young women, learning practical skills, being treated as just another recruit. On the 8th of May 1945, Victory in Europe Day, Elizabeth and Margaret were allowed to slip out of Buckingham Palace and join the celebrating crowds in the streets of London. Escorted by a small group of guards officers, the two princesses wandered through the jubilant throngs, anonymous in the mass of people. Elizabeth would later say it was one of the most memorable nights of her life, being part of that celebration, just another face in the crowd. The war had changed Britain profoundly. 250,000 British servicemen and 60,000 civilians were dead. Cities had been bombed to rubble. The economy was shattered. The empire was clearly dying, with independence movements growing stronger in India, Africa and elsewhere. Britain would emerge from the war victorious but exhausted, no longer the supreme power it had been. For Elizabeth, the war years had been formative. She had learned self-discipline, had seen her parents model duty and service under the most trying circumstances. She had glimpsed, briefly, life outside the royal bubble. And she had met, through correspondence that had begun in 1939, the man she would marry. The courtship. Elizabeth first met Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark in 1934, when she was 8 years old. They were at the wedding of Philip's cousin Princess Marina to Prince George, Duke of Kent. Elizabeth was a child, Philip a gangly teenager. Neither paid the other much attention. They met again in July 1939. The royal family was visiting the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, where Philip was a cadet. The king asked his cousin, Lord Mountbatten, to arrange for his nephew Philip to escort the two princesses. Philip was 18, tall, blonde, strikingly handsome. Elizabeth was 13, on the cusp of adolescence. Something sparked. Philip entertained the princesses that day, showing off by jumping over tennis nets, being charming and attentive. When it was time for the royal yacht to leave, Philip rowed out farther than any other cadet, continuing to wave as the yacht pulled away. Elizabeth stood on deck watching him until he was out of sight. They began to correspond. Through the war years, as Philip served with distinction in the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean and Pacific theatres, Elizabeth and Philip exchanged letters. The relationship grew through these exchanges. Philip's letters were witty, irreverent, full of humour and intelligence. Elizabeth was serious, thoughtful, increasingly devoted. By the time Philip returned to England after the war, the relationship had deepened into something more. Philip was 24, a battle-hardened naval officer who had seen combat, who had been mentioned in dispatches for his service at the Battle of Cape Matapan. Elizabeth was 19, sheltered but mature beyond her years. Philip was in many ways an unusual match for the heir to the British throne. He was a prince, but a prince without a kingdom. His family, the Greek royal family, had been exiled when he was an infant. His father had left when Philip was young, living with a mistress in Monte Carlo. His mother had suffered a mental breakdown and been institutionalized for years. Philip had been raised by relatives, shuttled between schools and guardians, never quite belonging anywhere. He was also, by the standards of the British establishment, foreign and penniless. He had been born in Corfu, educated in Germany and Scotland. He had served in the British Navy, but his connections were complicated. His sisters had all married German princes, some with Nazi connections. In post-war Britain, this was deeply problematic. But Elizabeth was in love, and she was determined. Her parents, recognizing the strength of her feelings, agreed to the match, but insisted on caution. When Philip proposed in the summer of 1946, the king asked that the formal announcement be delayed. He wanted Elizabeth to be certain, wanted time for the public to accept this foreign prince. In February 1947, the royal family embarked on a tour of South Africa. It was Elizabeth's first major overseas trip, a 3-month journey through what was then still a dominion of the British Empire. On the 21st of April, her 21st birthday, Elizabeth made a radio broadcast from Cape Town. She spoke to the Commonwealth, and in that speech she made a vow that would define her entire life. I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. The words were written for her, but she meant them. From that moment forward, service would be her guiding principle. The crown would not be a privilege to enjoy, but a duty to perform. When the family returned to England, the engagement was announced. On the 9th of July 1947, Buckingham Palace revealed that Princess Elizabeth would marry Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten. Royal Navy. Philip had renounced his Greek and Danish titles, had converted from Greek Orthodoxy to Anglicanism, had taken British citizenship and adopted his mother's family name Mountbatten. On the eve of the wedding, King George created him Duke of Edinburgh, Earl of Merioneth and Baron Greenwich. The wedding took place on the 20th of November 1947 at Westminster Abbey. It was the first grand royal celebration since before the war. Britain was still under rationing, still rebuilding from the devastation of war. Elizabeth had to use clothing ration coupons to purchase fabric for her wedding dress, designed by Norman Hartnell. The dress was made of ivory silk decorated with 10,000 seed pearls, with a 15-foot train. It was a glimpse of glamour in an age of austerity. 2,000 guests packed Westminster Abbey for the ceremony. 200 million people around the world listened on the radio. It was a moment of joy for a nation that had suffered so much. Elizabeth was 21, Philip 26. They rode from the Abbey to Buckingham Palace in an open carriage, waving to enormous crowds that lined the route. They honeymooned at Broadlands, the home of Philip's uncle Lord Mountbatten, and then at Birkhall on the Balmoral estate in Scotland. For a brief time, they had something close to a normal married life. Philip returned to his naval career, commanding first the frigate HMS Magpie. They lived in Malta, where Philip was stationed away from the spotlight of London. Elizabeth was simply a naval officer's wife, relatively anonymous, able to enjoy some freedom. In November 1948, Elizabeth gave birth to their first child, Charles Philip Arthur George. 2 years later, in August 1950, came their daughter, Anne Elizabeth Alice Louise. The family was growing. Philip was thriving in his naval career. They had a future ahead of them, years perhaps before the crown would claim Elizabeth. But fate had other plans. The death of a king. In the summer of 1951, King George VI's health began to fail. He had been ill for some time, suffering from what was diagnosed as a circulatory condition in his legs but was almost certainly lung cancer. He was a heavy smoker, and the stress of the war years and the unexpected burden of kingship had taken their toll. By autumn, he was clearly gravely ill. Princess Elizabeth began to take on more of her father's duties. She represented him at the Trooping the Colour ceremony. She undertook official engagements in his place. In October 1951, she and Philip embarked on a tour of Canada and the United States, standing in for the king. Everywhere they went, they were met with enthusiasm and affection. At Christmas 1951, the family gathered at Sandringham. The king seemed to rally, enjoying time with his grandchildren. But on the morning of the 31st of January 1952, Elizabeth and Philip left on a Commonwealth tour. They were deputising for the king, who was too ill to travel. The plan was to visit Kenya, Ceylon, Australia, and New Zealand, a journey that would take months. The king saw them off at the airport. It was the last time Elizabeth would see her father alive. The tour began in Kenya. On the 6th of February, Elizabeth and Philip were at Sagana Lodge, a hunting lodge that had been given to them as a wedding present. They had spent the previous day at Treetops, a hotel built in the branches of a giant fig tree overlooking a watering hole, watching elephants and other wildlife. That night, while Elizabeth slept in a remote corner of Kenya, her father died in his sleep at Sandringham House. He was 56 years old. A blood clot had formed in his heart, and he died without pain or warning in the early hours of the morning. The news took time to reach Kenya. Philip learned first from a royal equerry. He walked into the garden where Elizabeth was resting and told her that her father was dead. Elizabeth took the news calmly, with the composure that would mark her entire reign. She was 25 years old. She was now queen. The tour was immediately cancelled. Elizabeth and Philip flew back to London. As the plane touched down at the airport, Winston Churchill, once again Prime Minister, was waiting with the cabinet to greet their new queen. Elizabeth descended the steps dressed in black. Her reign had begun. On the 8th of February, Elizabeth was formally proclaimed Queen Elizabeth II at St James's Palace. She chose to reign as Elizabeth II, even though there had never been an Elizabeth I of the United Kingdom, only of England. Scotland had never had a Queen Elizabeth. The decision caused some controversy in Scotland, but it set the precedent. The proclamation was read at various locations around London, at the Royal Exchange, at Charing Cross. Guns fired salutes. Across the Commonwealth, in capitals from Ottawa to Canberra to New Delhi, similar proclamations were read. Elizabeth was now Queen of the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Pakistan, and Ceylon. She was head of the Commonwealth. The funeral of King George VI took place on the 15th of February at St George's Chapel, Windsor. His coffin was laid to rest in the royal vault. Watching the coffin being lowered were his widow, now Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, his 2 daughters and his grandchildren. The old king had served dutifully and well, but his life had been cut short by the burden he had never wanted to carry. For Elizabeth, the loss was profound. She'd been close to her father, had learned from him, had been preparing to be queen, but had hoped for many more years before that day came. Now the full weight of the crown was on her shoulders. The coronation was set for the 2nd of June 1953, more than a year after Elizabeth's accession. The intervening time was needed to prepare for the enormous ceremony. Though Elizabeth became queen the instant her father died, the coronation was the formal, sacred ceremony that would consecrate her as monarch. Westminster Abbey was closed to the public for months while preparations went forward. A labour force of 200 workers built tiered seating for more than 8,000 guests. The throne was positioned under the central crossing. Every detail was planned meticulously, from the order of the procession to the music, to be performed to the exact placement of each dignitary. The ceremony itself was ancient, dating back over 1,000 years. It followed a prescribed order: the recognition, the oath, the anointing, the investiture, the crowning, the homage. These were not merely symbolic acts, but sacramental ones, connecting the new monarch to every sovereign who had come before, back through the centuries to the very foundation of the kingdom. Elizabeth worked with the Archbishop of Canterbury, Geoffrey Fisher, to prepare for the ceremony. She practiced the movements, learned the responses, walked through the abbey in her own time to familiarise herself with the space and the choreography. She knew that this would be the most important and most public ceremony of her life. For months she rehearsed wearing the imperial state crown around Buckingham Palace, getting used to the weight of nearly 3 pounds of gold, diamonds, sapphires, emeralds and pearls perched on her head. The crown contained some of the most famous gems in the world, including the Black Prince's ruby and the Cullinan's II diamond. She needed to learn how to move with it, how to keep her head level so it wouldn't slip. The morning of June 2nd dawned bright and clear. Elizabeth was driven from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey in the Gold State coach, a magnificent gilded carriage built in 1762. She wore the crimson velvet robe of state, its train carried by 6 maids of honour. As the coach travelled through the streets of London, enormous crowds cheered. Despite the rain that began to fall, spirits were high. This was a moment of celebration for a nation still recovering from war. The route from the palace to the abbey was lined with spectators who had camped out overnight to secure the best views. Stands had been erected along the Mall and Whitehall. Flags and bunting decorated every building. The mood was festive, almost carnival-like. People wanted to believe in something again, wanted to celebrate, wanted to look forward rather than back at the grim years of war and austerity. Inside the abbey, Elizabeth went through the long ceremony with grace and composure. The service began with the recognition when the Archbishop of Canterbury presented Elizabeth to the congregation gathered in the four corners of the abbey, asking if they were willing to do homage to their queen. Each time the response was a thunderous, "God save Queen Elizabeth!" The ancient ritual was being performed once again, connecting this young woman to centuries of English and British monarchs. She took the coronation oath, swearing to govern according to law, to execute justice with mercy, to maintain the Protestant Reformed faith. Her voice was clear and steady. She had prepared for this moment her entire life, really, and especially intensely these past 16 months since her father's death. She understood the weight of the promises she was making. Then came the anointing, the most sacred part of the ceremony, so sacred that it was shielded from view by a canopy held by 4 knights of the Garter. The Archbishop anointed her with holy oil on her hands, breast and head. This oil had been prepared according to an ancient formula, containing oils of orange, roses, cinnamon, musk and ambergris. It had been consecrated in a special service days before. The anointing set the monarch apart, made her sacred, invested her with divine authority. It was a moment that harked back to the Old Testament kings of Israel, to the idea that monarchs ruled by God's grace. After the anointing, Elizabeth was dressed in the supertunica and the imperial mantle, heavy golden garments stiff with embroidery. She was invested with the regalia of sovereignty, each item presented with specific words and meaning. The golden spurs, though merely touched to her heels as she was a woman, symbolized chivalry and honor. The sword of state represented her duty to protect the church and the people. The armills, gold bracelets, symbolized sincerity and wisdom. The robe royal was placed over her shoulders. The orb, a golden sphere topped with a cross, was placed in her right hand, representing Christ's dominion over the world and the monarch's duty to rule in Christ's name. The ring, the wedding ring of England, was placed on the 4th finger of her right hand, marrying her to the nation. The sceptre with the cross, containing the enormous Cullinan diamond, the largest clear-cut diamond in the world, was placed in her right hand, representing temporal power and justice. The rod with the dove, symbolizing equity and mercy, was placed in her left hand. Then came the crowning itself. The Archbishop of Canterbury lifted St. Edward's crown, made of solid gold and weighing nearly 5 pounds, and placed it on Elizabeth's head. The moment the crown touched her head, the congregation shouted, "God save the Queen!" Guns fired salutes across London. The bells of Westminster Abbey rang out. Elizabeth II was crowned Queen. The peers and peeresses put on their coronets. The whole abbey was suddenly a sea of red velvet and ermine and gold coronets, a medieval spectacle come to life in the middle of the 20th century. After the homage, in which peers of the realm knelt before her and swore their loyalty, with Philip the first to kneel and pledge to be her liege man of life and limb, Elizabeth processed out of the abbey in the imperial state crown, carrying the orb and sceptre. She rode back to Buckingham Palace in the gold state coach, now wearing the crown and the purple robe of estate, as rain fell on the jubilant crowds. The coach swayed and rocked on its leather suspension, and Elizabeth had to concentrate on keeping the crown steady and the orb and sceptre balanced. It was physically demanding, this business of being crowned, and it would be hours yet before she could rest. The coronation was the first major event to be televised. Against the advice of some courtiers who thought the ceremony too sacred to be broadcast, Elizabeth had insisted that cameras be allowed into the abbey, though not to film the anointing. More than 20 million people in Britain watched on television, many for the first time, gathering in friends' homes or in public viewing spaces. The sale of television sets had boomed in the weeks before the coronation. Families who had never owned a television bought or rented one just for this event. Around the world, hundreds of millions more watched on delayed broadcasts or listened on radio. It was a global event, the young queen witnessed by a substantial portion of humanity. That evening, Elizabeth appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace with her family still wearing the crown. She waved to the crowds that filled the mall as far as the eye could see. At 27 years old, she'd been consecrated as queen, bound to her people and her role in the most solemn ceremony Western civilization could devise. The celebration continued for days with parties and pageants. Street parties erupted in neighbourhoods across Britain. Beacons were lit on hilltops. There were fireworks and concerts and feasts. The coronation gave the nation an excuse to celebrate, to come together, to feel part of something larger than their individual struggles. But for Elizabeth, the work was just beginning. She would need to learn to be queen, to navigate the complex relationships with her government, to represent the nation at home and the Commonwealth abroad, to modernise the monarchy while preserving its dignity and mystery. She would need to do all of this while raising 4 children and maintaining her marriage. It would prove to be the work of a lifetime. The early years of the reign, the 1950s, were in many ways the golden age of Elizabeth's reign. She was young, energetic, beautiful. Philip was dashing and handsome. They had 2 charming children with more to come. Britain, though no longer the supreme power it had been, was still a major force in the world. The empire was transforming into the Commonwealth, but the connection remained strong. The future seemed bright. Elizabeth threw herself into the work of being queen. In November 1953, just months after the coronation, she and Philip embarked on a 6-month Commonwealth tour, the longest ever undertaken by a reigning monarch. They travelled over 40,000 miles by sea and air, visiting 13 countries: Bermuda, Jamaica, Panama, Fiji, Tonga, New Zealand, Australia, the Cocos Islands, Ceylon, Aden, Uganda, Malta, and Gibraltar. The tour was exhausting. Elizabeth was away from her children for half a year. Charles was 5, Anne was 3. She missed them terribly, but duty came first. In Australia, an estimated 3/4 of the entire population came out to see her. In Sydney, over 1 million people lined the streets. The response was overwhelming, almost frightening in its intensity. Elizabeth represented something. For these people, a connection to Britain, to tradition, to a larger identity. She was the living embodiment of the Commonwealth, and they wanted to see her, to be near her, to feel part of what she represented. In New Zealand, she opened Parliament, the first reigning monarch to do so. In Tonga, she was greeted by the massive Queen Charlotte, who had charmed London during the coronation parade by refusing to close her carriage despite the rain. The 2 queens, one tiny and young, one enormous and middle-aged, created an odd but touching picture of Commonwealth unity. The tour established a pattern that would continue throughout her reign. Elizabeth would spend weeks, sometimes months, travelling to Commonwealth nations and other countries, representing Britain, strengthening bonds, showing the flag. It was soft power at its most effective. She couldn't sign treaties or declare war, but she could smile and wave and shake hands and show that Britain cared about its relationships with these nations. The 1950s also saw Elizabeth settling into her role at home. She held weekly audiences with her Prime Minister, first with Winston Churchill, who was in his 2nd term as Prime Minister and in his late 70s. Churchill had known Elizabeth since she was a child. He had served her father and now served her. The relationship was respectful, even affectionate, though Churchill sometimes forgot that she was now his sovereign, not the little girl he remembered. When Churchill's health failed and he finally resigned in 1955, he was succeeded by Anthony Eden. Eden's tenure was brief. and ended in disaster with the Suez Crisis in 1956. Britain and France, in collusion with Israel, invaded Egypt after Egypt's President Nasser nationalised the Suez Canal. The invasion was a humiliating failure, exposing Britain's weakness and dependence on the United States. Eden resigned in disgrace in 1957. Harold Macmillan succeeded Eden. Macmillan was smoother, more urbane, better able to manage the transition from empire to post-imperial Britain. He was Prime Minister when Elizabeth toured Canada and the United States in 1957, her first visit to America as Queen. She addressed the United Nations General Assembly, a historic moment. She also visited President Eisenhower, renewing the special relationship between Britain and America. Through these early years, Elizabeth was learning her craft. She discovered that being Queen was about consistency, about showing up, about never complaining or offering excuses. She learned to pace herself, to conserve her energy for the moments that mattered. She learned how to engage with people in a way that was warm without being familiar, interested without being intrusive. She perfected what would become her signature style. Brightly coloured coats and matching hats so she could be seen in crowds, sensible shoes for standing for hours, pearls and brooches that caught the light. She also learned the limits of her power when her sister Margaret wanted to marry Peter Townsend in 1955. Elizabeth was caught between her personal sympathy for Margaret and her duty as head of the Church of England. Townsend was divorced, and the Church did not permit remarriage after divorce. Elizabeth asked Margaret to wait until she was 25 when she could legally marry without the sovereign's permission. But the political and religious obstacles remained. Margaret eventually announced she would not marry Townsend, choosing duty over love. Elizabeth understood that sacrifice better than anyone. The 1960s brought new challenges and changes. In 1960, Elizabeth gave birth to Prince Andrew, her first child since becoming Queen. The birth was significant, the first child born to a reigning British monarch in over a century. 4 years later, in 1964, came Prince Edward. Elizabeth was now 48 years old, mother to 4 children ranging from 16-year-old Charles to infant Edward. The 1960s also brought social upheaval. The old deference to authority was breaking down. Young people were rebelling against the establishment. The Beatles were more popular than the royal family. Fashion was changing. Music was changing. Attitudes towards sex and drugs and authority were changing. Britain was becoming a more casual, less class-bound society. Elizabeth had to navigate these changes carefully. The monarchy couldn't seem stuffy and out of touch, but it also couldn't abandon its dignity and mystery. It was a delicate balance, and not everyone thought she got it right. The daily life of a queen. To understand Elizabeth as a person, not just as an icon, we must look at how she actually lived, day by day, year by year. Elizabeth was by nature a creature of habit and routine. She valued order, punctuality, consistency. These traits, which might seem mundane, were in fact essential to her success. The job of being queen was overwhelming in its scope and demands. The only way to manage it was through rigid structure and discipline. A typical day when Elizabeth was in London would begin early. She woke at 7:30, had breakfast in bed while reading the newspapers and going through her correspondence. The breakfast was simple, tea and toast or cereal, nothing elaborate. She would read the Times, the Daily Telegraph and the Racing Post, the latter for the horse racing news that was her personal passion. She marked articles with a pencil, noting items she wanted to discuss with her staff or file away for future reference. By 9, she was at her desk in her sitting room, beginning the work of being queen. The room was comfortable but not grand, filled with family photographs, paintings of horses, personal mementos accumulated over decades. Her desk was neat, organised, everything in its place. She worked with methodical efficiency, a trait learned from her father. The work was relentless. Every day brought red boxes, leather-covered boxes containing government documents that required her attention. These might include cabinet papers, Foreign Office telegrams, reports from governors general in Commonwealth nations, drafts of speeches, briefings on upcoming engagements. Elizabeth was expected to read everything, to be informed about every aspect of government policy, even though she had no formal power to change those policies. The red boxes followed her everywhere, even on holiday. Christmas Day might be the only day of the year when she didn't have to deal with them, though even that wasn't guaranteed. She read quickly but thoroughly, making notes in the margins, asking questions when something was unclear. Her staff learned that she noticed everything. If a document contained an error or an inconsistency, she would catch it. If a policy seemed to contradict an earlier position, she would ask about it. She had an extraordinary memory for detail, able to recall conversations and briefings from years before. She met regularly with her private secretaries, who managed her schedule and her relationship with the government. These men, and for most of her reign they were men, became trusted advisors and confidants. They learned to interpret her moods, to understand what she wanted without her having to spell it out. She wasn't demonstrative, rarely showed strong emotion, but those who worked with her could read the subtle signals. A slightly raised eyebrow indicated displeasure. A small smile meant approval. Silence meant she was thinking, considering, and they should wait. She held audiences with visiting dignitaries, ambassadors, bishops, military officers, recipients of honours. Each audience was carefully timed, usually 15 to 20 minutes, with the Queen standing throughout. It was said you could set your watch by her punctuality. If an audience was scheduled for 10:30, it would begin at exactly 10:30 and end at exactly 10:50. Not a minute earlier or later. Visitors learned to watch for the subtle signals that the audience was ending. The Queen would shift her weight slightly, would extend her hand for a final shake, would make a small step backward. The private secretary would materialize as if by magic to escort the visitor out. These audiences might seem perfunctory, but Elizabeth took them seriously. She did her homework, read the briefing papers, knew something about each person she was meeting. She could ask informed questions, could make small talk that showed genuine interest. This ability to make each person feel that they had her full attention, even if only for a few minutes, was one of her great skills. Once a week, usually on Tuesday evenings when she was in London, she met with the Prime Minister. These audiences were strictly private, no notes taken, no aides present. It was a chance for the Prime Minister to brief the Queen on government business, and for the Queen to ask questions, offer observations, sometimes gentle warnings based on her accumulated experience. The conversations were confidential, protected by convention. Neither the Queen nor the Prime Minister would ever reveal what was discussed. Over her 70-year reign, Elizabeth would meet with 15 Prime Ministers, from Winston Churchill to Liz Truss. She saw governments come and go, policies change, crises erupt and fade. But she remained, the constant point of reference. Prime Ministers served at most a decade or so. She served for 7. Her experience became unmatched. By the time Tony Blair became Prime Minister in 1997, Elizabeth had already dealt with 9 previous Prime Ministers. She'd seen the same issues cycle and recycle, the same debates played out again and again with different players but similar scripts. Prime Ministers valued these audiences because Elizabeth was uniquely positioned to offer perspective. She had no political agenda, no constituency to please, no election to win. She could speak frankly about what she thought would work and what wouldn't, based purely on experience. Some prime ministers listened more than others. Churchill treated her with an old-fashioned gallantry that bordered on condescension at first, though he grew to respect her judgment. Harold Wilson had a genuine rapport with her. Margaret Thatcher, Britain's first female prime minister, had a more complicated relationship with the Queen. Both were women of their generation, dutiful and hard-working, but their styles were different. Thatcher's certainty sometimes clashed with Elizabeth's more cautious evolutionary approach. Elizabeth's public duties were equally demanding. She attended countless ceremonies, openings, dedications, commemorations. She hosted state banquets at Buckingham Palace, elaborate formal dinners for visiting heads of state with gold plate and ancient protocol. The table would be set with the finest china and crystal, with elaborate floral arrangements, with place cards written in careful calligraphy. Elizabeth would wear a tiara, usually the Grand Duchess Vladimir tiara with emeralds, or the Girls of Great Britain and Ireland tiara, and a formal gown. The guests would be arranged by strict precedence. The menu would have been planned weeks in advance, approved by the Queen herself. These banquets were theatre, carefully choreographed displays of diplomatic courtesy and royal grandeur. But they were also work. Elizabeth had to make conversation with foreign leaders and their spouses, often through interpreters, finding common ground, building relationships. A state visit might last 3 or 4 days, filled with ceremonies and tours and exhibitions, and through it all, Elizabeth had to be charming, interested, gracious, even when she was tired or bored or had concerns about the visitor's human rights record. She invested thousands of people with honours, from knighthoods to lesser decorations, standing for hours pinning medals and exchanging a few words with each recipient. These investiture ceremonies took place at a Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle, usually in the morning. The recipients would line up, would be called forward one by one, would bow or curtsy, and Elizabeth would pin the medal or hang the decoration around their neck, would ask a question or two about their work, would shake hands, and they would move on. She might do this for 100 people or more in a single ceremony, repeating the same movements, the same gracious words, hour after hour. She travelled constantly. State visits abroad, Commonwealth tours, visits to every corner of the United Kingdom. She became the most travelled head of state in history, visiting over 100 countries during her reign. Each visit required months of preparation, briefing papers on local politics and customs, wardrobes planned down to the last hat and glove, speeches written and rewritten. She had to learn key phrases in local languages, had to know which topics were sensitive, had to remember names and faces and relationships. The travel was exhausting. Time zones, strange beds, different foods, constant public performance. Elizabeth was not naturally gregarious. She didn't particularly enjoy being the centre of attention, but she understood it was part of the job. She showed up, smiled, waved, shook hands, gave speeches, unveiled plaques, planted trees, reviewed troops. She did it all with professional competence, year after year, decade after decade. Yet in the midst of all this, Elizabeth maintained her private passions. Her love of horses was genuine and lifelong. She bred and raced thoroughbreds, studying bloodlines, visiting her stables, attending races whenever her schedule allowed. She could identify her horses at a distance, knew their personalities and quirks. When one of her horses won a race, the joy on her face was unfeigned. This was the one area of her life where she was not queen, but simply an enthusiast, competing on relatively equal terms with others who shared her passion. Her knowledge of horses and racing was encyclopedic. She could discuss bloodlines and form with trainers and jockeys, could debate the merits of different breeding programs, could watch a horse move and assess its potential. It was said that if she hadn't been queen, she could have made a successful career as a horse breeder or trainer. The racing world respected her expertise, not because she was queen, but because she genuinely knew what she was talking about. She loved her corgis, the short-legged Welsh herding dogs that became her signature. She owned more than 30 corgis during her lifetime, all descended from Susan, the corgi she received for her 18th birthday. She personally trained them, fed them from silver bowls, walked them herself in the palace gardens. They were constant companions, following her from room to room, sleeping in her bedroom. Palace staff learned to step carefully, as the corgis had the run of the place and were not always well behaved. Elizabeth allowed them liberties she allowed few others. Her relationship with Philip was the bedrock of her personal life. He had given up his naval career when she became queen, a sacrifice that was never easy for him. He was a man of action, of energy, of ambition. The role of consort, walking 3 steps behind, never being the centre of attention, never having the final say, chafed. He had to find a role for himself as the husband of the sovereign, a position without precedent or clear definition. Over time, Philip carved out his own path. He focused on youth programs, founding the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme that has helped millions of young people worldwide develop skills and confidence. He championed conservation and wildlife, serving as president of the World Wildlife Fund. He supported military charities, maintained his connection to the Royal Navy and the other services. He modernised the management of the royal estates, turning them into profitable enterprises, introducing modern farming methods, making them financially self-sufficient. He also became Elizabeth's indispensable support. He stood beside her at ceremonies, offered his arm, made small talk with guests to take some of the pressure off her. He could say things she couldn't, could be more blunt, more direct. If something needed to be said and Elizabeth couldn't say it, Philip often could. He protected her, shielded her, took on some of the burdens. Their marriage was not without strains. They were both strong-willed people. Philip could be blunt, sometimes harsh. His jokes sometimes crossed the line into offensive. He had a short temper and little patience for fools. Elizabeth was reserved, sometimes distant, not always emotionally available. They had different ways of processing stress. Philip wanted to talk things through, to confront problems directly. Elizabeth preferred to internalize, to process things privately, to maintain a calm exterior regardless of what she was feeling inside. They lived much of their lives in public, with little genuine privacy. Rumours of Philip's infidelities circulated for decades, though nothing was ever proven, and both Elizabeth and Philip maintained a dignified silence on the subject. But by all accounts, theirs was a strong partnership. They understood each other, supported each other, complemented each other's weaknesses. Elizabeth would later describe Philip as her strength and stay, the person who made her reign possible. After his death, people close to the Queen said she was never quite the same, that she had lost her anchor. They had 2 more children after becoming Queen and consort. Prince Andrew was born in 1960, the first child born to a reigning monarch in over a century. The birth was newsworthy, a reminder that the Queen was not just a symbol, but a woman with a life outside her public role. Prince Edward followed in 1964. Elizabeth was 38 when Edward was born, an older mother by the standards of the time. She was a more hands-on mother with these younger sons than she'd been able to be with Charles and Anne. When Charles and Anne were young, Elizabeth's duties had been overwhelming. She was a new queen, learning her role, travelling constantly. The children were often left with nannies while their parents toured the Commonwealth for months at a time. Charles in particular seems to have suffered from this early absence of his parents, becoming a lonely child who struggled to connect with his reserved mother and his demanding father. But with Andrew and Edward, Elizabeth had found her rhythm as queen. She could carve out more time for the children, could be more present in their daily lives. She still had her duties, still travelled, still worked from morning to night. But she made sure to be there for bedtime stories when she was home, for school plays and sports days when her schedule allowed. The family followed a regular pattern through the year. Christmas at Sandringham, the sprawling estate in Norfolk, with its red brick Jacobean mansion and thousands of acres of farm and woodland. The family would gather, sometimes 30 or 40 people, for a traditional Victorian Christmas. They would exchange gifts on Christmas Eve, following the German tradition brought to Britain by Prince Albert. They would attend church on Christmas morning at St Mary Magdalene on the estate. They would watch the Queen's Christmas broadcast, which was recorded in advance and aired in the afternoon. They would have elaborate meals with turkey and pudding and all the traditional trimmings. Easter meant Windsor Castle, the great medieval fortress that had been a royal residence for over 900 years. The family would attend Easter services at St George's Chapel. Elizabeth would often ride in Windsor Great Park, enjoying the spring weather and the bluebells that carpeted the woodland. Summer meant Balmoral in Scotland, the Highland retreat that Queen Victoria had built, and that every British monarch since had loved. This was when Elizabeth was happiest, most relaxed. She could wear comfortable country clothes instead of formal outfits. She could walk the hills with her dogs, fish for salmon in the River Dee, enjoy picnics in the heather. The family would have barbecues, with Philip grilling steaks and sausages. They would drive around the estate in Land Rovers. They would entertain guests, but informally, with long walks and simple meals rather than state banquets and ceremonies. Autumn meant back to Buckingham Palace, the working headquarters of the monarchy. The palace was more office than home, its hundreds of rooms filled with staff and visitors and the machinery of the royal household. Elizabeth's private apartments occupied only a small fraction of the enormous building, but it was where the work happened, where she held her audiences and meetings, where the red boxes arrived daily, where the state banquets were held. Each location had its rhythms and traditions, some dating back centuries. The moves between them followed a set schedule. The household staff would pack up and relocate, a massive logistical operation involving hundreds of people and tons of luggage. Elizabeth's wardrobe alone required careful planning. She needed different clothes for each location and season, for public and private events, for indoor and outdoor activities. Her dressers maintained detailed records of what she wore, when and where, to avoid repeating outfits too obviously. Elizabeth's personal tastes were surprisingly simple. She preferred plain food, roast meat and vegetables, nothing too fancy or exotic. She liked Dover sole, roast chicken, venison from Balmoral, lamb from Sandringham. She didn't care for rich sauces or complicated preparations. She ate to live rather than living to eat. She enjoyed gin and Dubonnet before lunch, a glass of wine with dinner, occasionally a glass of champagne on special occasions. She drank in moderation, never to excess. She loved jigsaw puzzles, completing them while listening to the radio. She would set up a puzzle on a table in her sitting room and work on it in spare moments, finding the quiet concentration soothing. She liked country pursuits, walking, riding, watching wildlife. She became an excellent mimic, able to imitate various politicians and dignitaries with a devastating accuracy. In private, she had a wicked sense of humour, quick wit, a talent for puncturing pomposity. She was not intellectual in the academic sense. She hadn't been to university, hadn't studied philosophy or literature deeply. She read biographies and histories, memoirs and racing form guides, not novels or poetry. Her intelligence was practical rather than theoretical, focused on understanding people and situations rather than abstract ideas. She dressed conservatively, in bright colours so she could be easily seen in crowds, with matching hats that became her trademark. Her style changed little over the decades. She found what worked and stuck with it. She wore sensible shoes that could handle hours of standing. She carried a handbag always, even though she never needed money or keys. The handbag became a signal to her staff. If she shifted it from one arm to the other, it meant she wanted to end the conversation. If she placed it on a table, it meant she wanted to leave within 5 minutes. Her jewellery was spectacular. She owned some of the most famous pieces in the world, tiaras and necklaces and brooches that had belonged to queens and empresses for centuries. She wore them as tools of state, understanding that the magnificence was not for her personally, but for the institution she represented. The jewellery was part of the theatre of monarchy, the visual display of continuity and majesty. When she wore Queen Victoria's sapphires, or the diamond diadem worn by every queen since George IV's time, she was connecting herself to the long line of British monarchs, showing that the institution endured. In private, she was said to be warm with those she trusted. She had close friendships that lasted decades, with her dressers and private secretaries, with a few members of the nobility who had known her since childhood. But she kept most people at a distance. She couldn't afford to be too familiar, too accessible. The mystery and dignity of monarchy required separation, required her to be set apart. This was the daily reality of Elizabeth's life, not glamorous in the Hollywood sense, not filled with excitement and adventure. Rather, it was a life of unrelenting duty, of endless responsibilities, of public performance day after day, year after year, decade after decade. It required extraordinary discipline, stamina, and commitment. The same routine, the same rituals, the same responsibilities, repeated endlessly. Many would have found it stifling, boring, unbearable. But Elizabeth found meaning in it. She had promised to serve, and this was service. Every audience, every ceremony, every red box read and returned was a small fulfillment of that promise made on her 21st birthday in Cape Town, and Elizabeth proved equal to the task. Year after year, decade after decade, she showed up, did the work, fulfilled her duties. She never complained publicly, never suggested the burden was too great. She simply carried on, the embodiment of duty and service. The challenges of change. Elizabeth came to the throne at the end of the Age of Empires. During her reign, she would preside over the transformation of the British Empire into the Commonwealth of Nations, a voluntary association of independent states. When she was crowned in 1953, she was Queen of 7 independent nations, and head of an empire that still included colonies and territories across Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. By the 1960s, that empire was dissolving. Country after country gained independence. Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, Malaya, Singapore, countless others. Each independence was a moment of loss for Britain, the end of centuries of empire, but Elizabeth approached them as opportunities. She attended many of the independence ceremonies, handing over power with grace, emphasizing the continuing bonds of the Commonwealth. She understood, perhaps better than many of her governments, that the Commonwealth would only survive if it was truly voluntary, if the connection was based on affection and shared values rather than coercion. She worked tirelessly to nurture these relationships, visiting Commonwealth nations repeatedly, hosting Commonwealth heads of government meetings, using her personal influence to keep the disparate nations together. Her relationship with the Commonwealth was genuine. She saw it as a family of nations, diverse but united, and she saw herself as head of that family. When apartheid South Africa was threatening to tear the Commonwealth apart in the 1980s, she worked behind the scenes to find a path forward. When Margaret Thatcher's government seemed ready to abandon sanctions against the apartheid regime, Elizabeth reportedly made her displeasure known, a rare instance of the Queen coming close to public disagreement with her government. At home, Britain was changing as well. The rigid class system of her youth was breaking down. The 1960s brought social revolution, challenges to authority, demands for greater equality and freedom. The monarchy had to adapt or risk becoming irrelevant. Elizabeth understood this, though she moved cautiously. In 1969, she allowed a BBC documentary crew unprecedented access to film the royal family in their private life. Royal Family showed the Windsors having a barbecue at Balmoral, Elizabeth buying sweets for young Edward at a shop, Philip grilling steaks, the family being supposedly normal. Over 30 million people in Britain watched. It humanised the monarchy, made them seem more relatable. But it also sparked a debate that would continue throughout her reign. How much mystery should the monarchy maintain? Did familiarity breed contempt? The documentary was later withdrawn from circulation, not shown again during Elizabeth's lifetime. The experiment in openness had gone perhaps too far. The difficult decades. The 1970s were hard years for Britain and for the monarchy. The economy was struggling, buffeted by oil shocks and inflation. Industrial strife paralysed the nation. The IRA was conducting a bombing campaign on the British mainland. The optimism of the 1960s had curdled into cynicism and unrest. For Elizabeth, the decade brought personal challenges. In 1972, she celebrated her silver wedding anniversary with Philip, 25 years of marriage. The celebrations were subdued compared to what they would become for later jubilees. The country wasn't in a mood for lavish royal spectacle. In 1973, Princess Anne married Captain Mark Phillips in Westminster Abbey. It was the first major royal wedding since Elizabeth's own in 1947. Anne, a young, talented equestrian who would go on to compete in the Olympics, was the most athletic of Elizabeth's children. She was also the most like her father in temperament, direct, no-nonsense, impatient with ceremony and fuss. The following year, 1974, saw a shocking incident that brought home the reality of the threats the royal family faced. Anne and Mark Phillips were driving down the Mall when their car was forced to stop by another vehicle. A man approached with a gun, attempting to kidnap the princess. Anne's personal protection officer was shot trying to defend her. A journalist and a police officer who intervened were also shot. Anne herself remained calm throughout, at one point telling the gunman, "Not bloody likely," when he ordered her out of the car. The would-be kidnapper was eventually overpowered and arrested. All the wounded survived. But it was a stark reminder that being royal carried real dangers. In 1977, Elizabeth celebrated her silver jubilee 25 years on the throne. There had been some question about whether the public would respond positively. Britain was in the midst of economic crisis. Punk rock was challenging established authority. The Sex Pistols had released God Save the Queen, with lyrics calling the monarchy a fascist regime. But when the celebrations began, the response was overwhelming. Street parties erupted across the country. Millions lined the routes of the Queen's tours through Britain. The affection was real and deep. The Jubilee seemed to show that for all the changes in British society, for all the challenges to traditional authority, the monarchy still had a place in people's hearts. Elizabeth represented continuity, stability, a connection to something larger and older than the present moment. In uncertain times, that mattered. The 1980s brought new prime ministers and new challenges. Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister in 1979, the first woman to hold the office. The relationship between the Queen and the Prime Minister was complex. Both were women of duty and discipline, both worked extraordinarily hard. But their approaches differed. Thatcher was ideological, certain of her rightness, willing to confront and divide. Elizabeth was pragmatic, cautious, focused on unity and continuity. There were reported tensions, particularly over Thatcher's approach to South Africa and the Commonwealth. The Sunday Times published a story claiming the Queen was concerned about Thatcher's policies, that she found the Prime Minister's approach divisive and uncaring toward the poor. Buckingham Palace denied the story, but the denial was carefully worded. The speculation continued. Whatever the private tensions, publicly Elizabeth and Thatcher maintained a correct professional relationship. They met weekly for their audiences following the established protocol. Thatcher curtsied, addressed Elizabeth as ma'am, conducted herself with scrupulous propriety. But it was said that the audiences were more formal, less relaxed, than with some other prime ministers. The 1980s also brought joy and scandal to the royal family in equal measure. In 1981, Prince Charles married Lady Diana Spencer in a fairy tale wedding at St. Paul's Cathedral. Diana was 20 years old, beautiful, shy, seemingly perfect for the role of Princess of Wales. 750 million people worldwide watched the ceremony on television. It seemed like the dawn of a new golden age for the monarchy. But behind the fairy tale, problems were already evident to those paying attention. Charles and Diana barely knew each other. Charles was 32, set in his ways, intellectual, uncomfortable with emotion. Diana was 19 years younger, needy, romantic, craving affection and attention. They were profoundly unsuited to each other. In June 1982, Diana gave birth to Prince William, and the nation rejoiced. Here was the heir's heir, the future of the monarchy assured. 2 years later, in 1984, came Prince Harry. The Waleses seemed to have everything: youth, beauty, children, public adoration. But the marriage was already failing. Charles was still in love with Camilla Parker Bowles, a relationship that had begun before his marriage to Diana and had resumed afterward. Diana, feeling unloved and trapped, developed bulimia and began her own affairs. The War of the Waleses, as it would come to be known, had begun. Elizabeth watched this unfold with growing concern. She valued privacy, discretion, duty above personal happiness. The idea that her son and daughter-in-law would air their marital problems publicly was anathema to her. But she also recognised that times had changed, that the media was more intrusive, that the old rules of silence and stoicism no longer applied. In 1986, Elizabeth made her first visit to mainland China, a historic trip that symbolised Britain's relationship with the emerging Asian giant. The sight of the Queen walking along the Great Wall, visiting the Forbidden City, was remarkable. This was a woman who had been born when China was still an empire, who had seen the Communist Revolution, the Cultural Revolution, and now China's opening to the world. The same year saw another personal crisis. Prince Andrew married Sarah Ferguson, a vivacious redhead known as Fergie. The marriage would prove even more disastrous than Charles and Diana's. Andrew and Sarah were genuinely in love at first, but Andrew's naval career kept them apart for long periods. Sarah, left alone with media scrutiny and no clear role, began to act out. Her behaviour became increasingly erratic and embarrassing. Elizabeth's 60th birthday in 1986 was marked with relatively little fanfare. She was not one for personal celebration, but she was now in her 7th decade, had been queen for 34 years, was becoming a genuinely historic figure. People who had been born after her accession were now middle-aged. She'd become a permanent fixture, as much a part of British life as Big Ben or the changing of the guard. The turbulent 90s. The 1990s would prove to be the most difficult decade of Elizabeth's reign. It began hopefully enough. In 1990, Margaret Thatcher resigned after 11 years as Prime Minister, replaced by John Major. Major was more conciliatory, easier for Elizabeth to work with. The relationship was warmer, more relaxed. But family troubles were mounting. In 1992, which Elizabeth would famously call her annus horribilis, everything seemed to go wrong at once. In March, it was announced that Andrew and Sarah were separating. Their marriage had lasted less than 6 years. The tabloids revelled in the scandal, particularly photos of Sarah on vacation with her financial advisor, a Texan millionaire. In April, Princess Anne divorced her first husband, Mark Phillips. Their marriage had been troubled for years, conducted largely separately, but the formal divorce was still a blow. Anne would remarry later that year to Commander Timothy Lawrence, a naval officer, in a quiet ceremony in Scotland. In June, Diana, her true story was published. Written by Andrew Morton but based on secret interviews with Diana herself, the book exposed the full misery of the Wales marriage. Diana's bulimia, her suicide attempts, Charles's affair with Camilla, all was laid bare for the public. The book was a sensation, selling millions of copies, fundamentally changing how the public viewed the royal family. In November, a devastating fire broke out at Windsor Castle. It started in the Queen's private chapel, caused by a spotlight that ignited a curtain. The fire raged for 15 hours, destroying or damaging over 100 rooms, including St. George's Hall and the state apartments. Priceless works of art were destroyed. Some were saved by a human chain of staff and soldiers who passed paintings and furniture out of the burning building. Elizabeth visited the burned castle and was photographed standing in the rubble, looking devastated. It was one of the rare times the public saw her composure crack. Windsor was her favourite residence, the place where she felt most at home. To see it damaged was genuinely painful. Then came the question of who would pay for the repairs. The government initially suggested the public should pay, since Windsor was a national monument. But the public was outraged. Why should they pay to repair the Queen's house when they were struggling economically? The backlash was fierce and ugly. In response, Elizabeth agreed to begin paying income taxes for the first time, something she had never done before. She also agreed to open Buckingham Palace to tourists during the summer months, using the entrance fees to help fund the Windsor repairs. These were significant concessions, acknowledgements that the monarchy had to justify its cost. In December, Charles and Diana formally separated. The announcement came just days after Elizabeth gave a speech at London's Guildhall, marking her 40 years on the throne. She spoke of 1992 as an annus horribilis, a horrible year. Her voice was hoarse from a cold, her expression weary. It was a rare public acknowledgement that things had been difficult. The troubles continued. In 1994, Charles gave a television interview in which he admitted his adultery, though only he claimed after his marriage had irretrievably broken down. The next year, Diana gave her own interview to BBC Panorama, in which she spoke of Charles's affair, of her own affair with James Hewitt, of her struggles with bulimia and mental health. Famously, she said there were 3 people in her marriage, so it was a bit crowded. The interviews were devastating for the monarchy's reputation. The heir to the throne was an admitted adulterer. His wife was unstable and manipulative. The marriage was a sham. The royal family seemed dysfunctional, dishonest, out of touch. Opinion polls showed support for the monarchy dropping to historic lows. In 1996, Charles and Diana finally divorced. The terms were generous to Diana. She received a substantial settlement and could continue to live at Kensington Palace. But she was stripped of her Royal Highness title, a decision that would later be seen as petty and vindictive. Elizabeth hoped that with the divorce finalised, the family could move past the scandal and rebuild. But fate had other plans. The death of Diana. On the 31st of August 1997, Diana, Princess of Wales, died in a car crash in Paris. She had been fleeing paparazzi through the Pont de l'Alma tunnel when her car, driven at high speed by a drunk driver, crashed into a pillar. Diana and her companion, Dodi Fayed, were killed. Only one person in the car survived. The news reached Balmoral in the early hours of the morning. Elizabeth's first concern was for William and Harry, who were staying at Balmoral with their father and grandparents. They were told of their mother's death when they woke. The family's priority was protecting the boys, giving them privacy to grieve away from the media circus that was already building. But in London, a different kind of reaction was building. Thousands of people were laying flowers outside Kensington Palace, Diana's home. The pile of flowers grew to massive proportions, along with cards and teddy bears and messages of grief. The public mourning was intense, almost hysterical. Diana had touched something deep in the national psyche. She had been beautiful, troubled, vulnerable, and now she was dead at 36. The royal family remained at Balmoral. This was consistent with royal tradition. The Queen was not Diana's blood relation. Diana had been divorced from the family. The family's priority was the boys, but the public didn't see it that way. They wanted to see the Queen grieve, wanted her to return to London, wanted the flag over Buckingham Palace lowered to half-mast. The flag issue became particularly fraught. The flagpole at Buckingham Palace only flew the royal standard when the sovereign was in residence. When the sovereign was away, no flag flew. This was a long-standing tradition, but the public wanted to see a flag at half-mast as a sign of mourning for Diana. The palace stuck to protocol, no flag. The criticism mounted. The tabloids turned ugly. The Queen was called cold, uncaring, out of touch. For the first time in her reign, she faced genuinely hostile public opinion. The quiet dignity that usually served her so well was now seen as indifference. Finally, Elizabeth returned to London. She walked among the flowers outside Kensington Palace, viewed the messages, showed herself to be moved. She gave a televised address to the nation, praising Diana as an exceptional and gifted human being. She agreed to allow a flag to fly at half-mast over Buckingham Palace. These were significant concessions, breaks with protocol that acknowledged the strength of public feeling. Diana's funeral took place on September 6th at Westminster Abbey. It was watched by an estimated 2.5 billion people worldwide, making it one of the most watched events in television history. Elizabeth and the royal family attended, walking behind Diana's coffin alongside William and Harry in a procession that many found heartbreaking. The sight of the two young princes, aged 15 and 12, walking behind their mother's coffin, stoic and devastated, moved the world. The funeral was a mixture of royal pomp and modern celebrity. Elton John sang Candle in the Wind, rewritten for Diana. Diana's brother, Earl Spencer, gave a eulogy that contained thinly veiled criticism of the royal family for how they had treated Diana. The applause for his speech was extraordinary, rare in the formal setting of Westminster Abbey. Diana's death marked a low point for the monarchy. The institution had seemed tone-deaf, unable to read the public mood, trapped in outdated protocols. Trust in the royal family was at historic lows. There was serious discussion about whether the monarchy would survive, whether Charles would ever become king, whether William might skip a generation. But gradually the storm passed. The public's grief for Diana faded. Life moved on. The monarchy, battered but still standing, began to rebuild. Elizabeth had learned lessons about the need to be more responsive to public sentiment, more willing to bend protocol when necessary. The monarchy would need to modernise, to show more emotion, to be more accessible. It was a hard lesson, learned late in her life. but Elizabeth proved capable of adapting even in her 70s. The personal trials. Not all the challenges Elizabeth faced were political or constitutional. Some were deeply personal, played out on the world stage with painful publicity. Her sister Margaret's life was marked by tragedy and scandal. Margaret had wanted to marry Peter Townsend, a divorced equerry, in the 1950s. The Church of England did not permit remarriage after divorce, and as Supreme Governor of the Church, Elizabeth could not approve the marriage. Margaret was forced to choose between love and duty. She chose duty, giving up Townsend. Later, she married Anthony Armstrong Jones, a photographer, but the marriage ended in divorce. Margaret's life became one of frustrated potential, of parties and affairs, of declining health and increasing bitterness. Elizabeth's own children's marriages were, with the exception of Anne's second marriage, failures. Charles and Diana's spectacular collapse in the 1990s, played out in the tabloids with excruciating detail, damaged the monarchy's reputation. Diana's death in 1997 in a car crash in Paris while fleeing paparazzi brought the monarchy to perhaps its lowest point in Elizabeth's reign. The public outpouring of grief for Diana seemed to implicitly criticise the royal family, seen as cold and unfeeling. Elizabeth's response to Diana's death was initially to stay at Balmoral with her grandsons William and Harry, believing they needed privacy and protection from the media. But the public wanted to see the Queen grieve, wanted her to return to London to acknowledge Diana's death publicly. For once, Elizabeth's instinct for privacy and protection clashed with public expectations. She did return to London, did walk among the flowers left outside Buckingham Palace, did make a televised tribute to Diana. But the damage was done. The monarchy seemed out of touch, unable to read the public mood. It was a rare misstep for a queen who had successfully navigated so many challenges. The year 1992, Elizabeth famously called her annus horribilis, a horrible year. Windsor Castle caught fire, destroying priceless art and historic rooms. Andrew and Sarah Ferguson separated. Anne divorced her first husband. Charles and Diana's separation was announced. The tabloids were filled with scandalous stories, tapped phone conversations, unauthorized biographies. It seemed the firm, as the family called itself, was falling apart. Through all of this, Elizabeth maintained her composure. She continued to perform her duties, to represent the nation, to embody stability and continuity. She understood that the monarchy was larger than any individual, that her job was to preserve the institution for future generations. Personal happiness or family peace could not be allowed to interfere with that duty. The golden years. As Elizabeth aged, paradoxically, her popularity grew. The difficulties of the 1990s receded. The new millennium brought a renewed appreciation for the Queen as a link to history, as the last connection to the wartime generation, as a figure of stability in an increasingly chaotic world. In 2002, Elizabeth celebrated her Golden Jubilee, marking 50 years on the throne. There were tours, celebrations, concerts. The public response was warm-hearted and enthusiastic. The same year also brought sadness, with the death of her sister Margaret in February and her mother in March. The Queen Mother had lived to be 101, a beloved figure who had stood by her husband's side during the war and supported her daughter throughout her reign. In 2012, the Diamond Jubilee marked 60 years. Elizabeth was now 86 years old, the oldest British monarch in history and still working. The celebrations included a river pageant on the Thames, a concert at Buckingham Palace, events across the Commonwealth. Over 1 million people lined the Thames to watch, despite cold rain. The affection for the Queen was clear. In 2015, Elizabeth surpassed Queen Victoria's record to become the longest reigning British monarch. She marked the occasion quietly, opening a railway in Scotland, saying it was not a moment she had ever aspired to reach. Characteristically, she deflected tension, focused on duty rather than personal achievement. Through her 90s, Elizabeth continued working. She still carried out hundreds of engagements each year, still met with prime ministers, still read her red boxes. Age brought some concessions. She gave up riding horses after a fall, gave up long-haul travel, reduced her public appearances, but she did not retire, would never retire. She had promised to serve her whole life, and she meant it. In 2017, Philip retired from public duties at the age of 96. He had completed over 22,000 solo engagements during his time as consort, an extraordinary record of service, but he was tired, ready to step back. Elizabeth continued alone, supported by other members of the family, particularly Charles and William. The 2020s brought new challenges. The COVID-19 pandemic shut down normal life. The Queen gave a rare address to the nation, broadcast on television, reassuring the country. "We will meet again," she said, echoing the famous wartime song. She was 94 years old, isolating at Windsor Castle, but still providing the steady reassurance the nation needed. In early 2021, Philip fell ill. He was hospitalised for several weeks with an infection and heart problems. He returned to Windsor Castle but never fully recovered. On the 9th of April 2021, he died peacefully in his sleep. He was 99 years old, just 2 months short of his 100th birthday. Elizabeth was devastated. Philip had been her constant companion for 73 years of marriage. They had been teenagers when they met, had grown old together. His funeral, held at St George's Chapel, Windsor during pandemic restrictions, showed the Queen sitting alone in a pew, masked, separated from even her family by social distancing rules. It was an image of profound loneliness, the monarch isolated even in grief. But she carried on. There was a platinum jubilee to mark in 2022, 70 years on the throne. No British monarch had ever reached this milestone. The celebrations in June included parades, concerts, parties across the nation. Elizabeth appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace to wave to the crowds, but her appearances were limited. She was increasingly frail, struggling with mobility issues, but she was still present, still the embodiment of continuity and service. The final summer. The summer of 2022 was spent at Balmoral, as always. Elizabeth loved the Scottish Highlands, the wild beauty of the landscape, the privacy the estate afforded. She'd been coming here since childhood. It was in many ways home and away the palaces could never be. But this summer was different. She was noticeably weaker. She moved slowly, needed a cane, sometimes a wheelchair. Her schedule was reduced to essential engagements. Those close to her could see that the end was approaching, though no one wanted to say it aloud. On the 6th of September, she performed what would be her final official duty. Liz Truss, the new Prime Minister, travelled to Balmoral rather than the Queen travelling to London for the traditional audience. Photographs from that meeting show Elizabeth smiling, dressed in a skirt and cardigan, leaning on a cane. But she looks fragile, her hand bruised, her smile determined but weary. 2 days later, on the 8th of September, the palace announced that doctors were concerned for the Queen's health and that she was under medical supervision. The family began to race north. Charles arrived by helicopter. Anne was already there. William, Andrew, Edward, all tried to get to Balmoral, though some would not make it in time. At 3:10 in the afternoon, Elizabeth's heart stopped. She died peacefully, without pain, in the place she loved most. Anne was with her, holding her hand. It was the death she would have wanted, if we can speak of wanting such a thing. Quiet, private, in the Scottish hills. The announcement came at 6:30 that evening. "The Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon," the statement read. Within minutes the news flashed around the world. Flags were lowered to half-mast, crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace. The news anchors wore black. The world paused to mark the passing of a figure who had been a constant presence for so long that many could not remember a time before her. The mourning. The period that followed Elizabeth's death was unprecedented in modern British history. The nation entered 10 days of official mourning, a choreographed sequence of events that had been planned for decades under the code name Operation London Bridge. On the 11th of September, Elizabeth's coffin left Balmoral, draped in the royal standard of Scotland and topped with a wreath of flowers from the estate. It travelled by hearse through the Scottish countryside, through towns where crowds gathered on the streets to watch the cortege pass. People threw flowers, they stood in silence, some wept. The coffin arrived at the Palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh, where it lay at rest for a day. Then it was moved to St Giles Cathedral, where the people of Scotland could file, past and pay their respects. 33,000 people waited in line for hours to spend a few seconds walking past the Queen's coffin. On the 13th of September, the coffin was flown to London and driven to Buckingham Palace. The next day, it was moved to Westminster Hall, the oldest part of the Palace of Westminster, where it would lie in state. The coffin sat on a raised platform guarded by soldiers from the Household Division, who stood vigil in shifts that changed every 20 minutes. The hall was open 24 hours a day for 4 days. The queue to see the Queen lying in state became a phenomenon unto itself. People waited for 10, 12, 14 hours, snaking along the Thames for miles. Over 250,000 people eventually filed through Westminster Hall, a cross-section of the nation, the old and the young, the rich and the poor, the famous and the unknown. They came to pay their respects, to mark the end of an era, to say goodbye to a queen. Most of them had known their entire lives. The state funeral was held on the 19th of September at Westminster Abbey. 2,000 guests filled the ancient church, including kings and queens, presidents and prime ministers from around the world. President Biden was there, representing the United States, Emmanuel Macron from France, leaders from across the Commonwealth. It was the largest gathering of world leaders in years. The service was solemn and traditional, following a liturgy unchanged in centuries. Hymns were sung that Elizabeth herself had chosen years before. The Archbishop of Canterbury gave the sermon, praising Elizabeth's abundant life and loving service. The Dean of Westminster delivered the commendation, committing her body to the ground and her soul to God. The coffin was then carried from the Abbey on a gun carriage, pulled by Royal Navy sailors. It processed through the streets of London to Wellington Arch, with the new King Charles and his sons William and Harry walking behind, along with other members of the royal family. Enormous crowds lined the route, silent except for the tolling of Big Ben and the sound of drums marking the slow march. At Wellington Arch, the coffin was placed in a hearse and driven to Windsor, 20 miles west. There, it was met by another procession that carried it up the long walk to Windsor Castle, past crowds that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. At St George's Chapel, a committal service was held, a smaller, more intimate ceremony for the family and close associates. The Lord Chamberlain broke his wand of office and placed it on the coffin, symbolising the end of Elizabeth's reign. The Dean of Windsor said the final prayers. Then the coffin was lowered into the royal vault beneath the chapel. Later that evening, in a private ceremony attended only by the closest family members, Elizabeth's coffin was placed in the King George VI Memorial Chapel, a small side chapel within St George's. She was laid to rest alongside Philip, whose coffin had been held in the vault awaiting her. Also buried in that small chapel were her father George VI, her mother Elizabeth, and her sister Margaret. The family was together again. The legacy. Queen Elizabeth II reigned for 70 years and 214 days. In that time, she saw the world transformed in ways that would have been unimaginable when she was born. She came into a world of empires and left a world of nations. When she was born, the British Empire was the dominant global power. When she died, Britain was a medium-sized nation struggling to find its place in a world dominated by the United States and China. She lived through the Second World War, the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union, the rise of China, 9/11, the War on Terror, the financial crisis, the COVID pandemic. She saw the invention of television, computers, the internet, smartphones. She went from a world where most communication was by letter to a world where billions of people could be reached instantly. Through all of this change, she represented continuity. She was the constant, the still point in a turning world. People who'd been alive in the 1920s knew her. People born in the 2020s would remember her. She bridged generations and eras. Her actual political power was minimal. Britain is a constitutional monarchy, where the sovereign reigns but does not rule. Elizabeth could advise, could encourage, could warn. But she could not command. The real power lay with elected officials, yet her influence was real. Prime ministers valued her counsel precisely because it was non-partisan, because she had seen so many governments come and go, because her experience was unmatched. She met with 15 prime ministers during her reign: Churchill, Eden, Macmillan, Douglas Home, Wilson, Heath, Callaghan, Thatcher, Major, Blair, Brown, Cameron, May, Johnson, Truss. Each came to office full of ideas and plans. She had seen it all before. She knew which battles were worth fighting, which were not. Her weekly audiences with the Prime Minister became, for many of them, an oasis of calm in the chaos of governing. She also represented the Commonwealth in a way no one else could. The Commonwealth, that voluntary association of 56 nations, many of them former British colonies, might well have dissolved without her personal commitment. She travelled tirelessly throughout the Commonwealth, from Canada to Australia, from Jamaica to Kenya, building personal relationships with leaders, showing that the connection was real and valued. When she died, many Commonwealth nations questioned whether they would remain in the organisation under King Charles. Her personal bond had been that important. Elizabeth's reign also saw the transformation of the monarchy itself. When she came to the throne, the royal family was remote, mysterious, formal. By the end, they were regular subjects of tabloid coverage, their private lives dissected, their failings exposed. This was partly inevitable in the age of mass media and the internet, but it was also partly the result of choices made, experiments in accessibility that sometimes went too far. The question of the monarchy's future remains open. Support for the institution is strong in Britain, though less so among younger generations. Many Commonwealth nations are considering becoming republics. The model of constitutional monarchy that Elizabeth represented so well may not survive many more decades in our democratic age. But whatever the future holds, Elizabeth's legacy is secure. She showed that duty and service could be a life's purpose. She demonstrated extraordinary discipline and dedication, working into her 90s when most people would have retired decades before. She weathered scandals and crises with dignity, never complaining, never explaining, never wavering in her commitment. She was not a saint. She made mistakes. Her response to Diana's death was too slow. Her relationship with some of her children was distant. She benefited from enormous privilege and never truly challenged the inequalities that privilege represented. The monarchy she embodied was, at its core, anti-democratic, based on inherited position rather than merit. but she understood her role and played it as well as anyone could have. She provided stability and continuity for a nation going through wrenching change. She embodied certain virtues: duty, service, uncomplaining perseverance, that many found admirable even if they questioned the institution she represented. She was also, by all accounts, a person of genuine warmth and humour in private, capable of mimicry and jokes, devoted to her family despite the demands of her role, happiest when riding horses or walking her dogs or spending time with her grandchildren at Balmoral. The world she was born into is gone, swept away by war and technology and social change. The empire she was meant to symbolize dissolved during her reign. But she adapted, changed with the times while holding to her core values. She promised at 21 to devote her whole life to service, and she kept that promise until her 96th year, until her last breath in a castle in Scotland she had loved since childhood. Closing reflection. Consider what Elizabeth's life tells us about the power of commitment. She did not choose to be queen. The crown came to her through accident of birth and abdication. But once it was hers, she dedicated herself completely to the role. She could have been resentful, could have chafed at the restrictions, could have done the minimum required. Instead, she embraced the burden and carried it with grace for 7 decades. Her life was not glamorous in the way people often imagine royalty. It was repetitive, constrained, filled with ceremony and protocol. She could rarely speak freely, could never act on impulse, had to always be aware that she was being watched and judged. The cost in terms of personal freedom was enormous, yet she found meaning in the work. She believed in service, in duty, in the idea that her position gave her an opportunity and an obligation to represent something larger than herself. Whether you agree with the institution of monarchy or not, there is something admirable in that dedication. In her Christmas broadcast in 1957, Elizabeth spoke about the importance of service. "I cannot lead you into battle. I do not give you laws or administer justice, but I can do something else. I can give you my heart and my devotion to these old islands and to all the peoples of our brotherhood of nations." This was her gift and her burden. Not power, not glory, but dedication. A life spent in service to an idea, to a nation, to a commonwealth of nations. She showed us that such a life was possible, that duty and commitment could sustain a person through decades of work. At Windsor Castle, in the King George VI Memorial Chapel, a black stone slab now marks the final resting place of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. It bears simply their names, their dates of birth and death, nothing more. No grand monuments, no elaborate statues, just 2 lives, lived long and lived fully, now at rest together. The River Thames still flows past London, as it did when Elizabeth was born in a townhouse in Mayfair nearly a century ago. The hills of Scotland still rise around Balmoral, purple with heather in summer. The world turns, the seasons change, life continues. But the connection between a young princess who promised to serve and an old queen who kept that promise until her last breath, that connection remains. It reminds us that character matters, that commitment can be sustained, that duty need not be a prison, but can be a purpose. Queen Elizabeth II was many things: monarch, mother, grandmother, horsewoman, dog lover, symbol, institution. But perhaps most importantly, she was a person who understood that she had been given a role to play and who played it with unwavering dedication for 70 years. In an age of constant change, she was constant. In a time of self-promotion, she was self-effacing. In an era of instant gratification, she embodied patient, lifelong commitment. Whether the monarchy survives or fades, whether the Commonwealth endures or dissolves, Elizabeth's life stands as a testament to what one person can achieve through sheer force of will and dedication. She showed us that service can be its own reward. that duty can give meaning to a life, that keeping one's promises matters. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the extraordinary life of Queen Elizabeth II. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What moment in Elizabeth's long life resonates most with you? Until our next journey into history, I wish you a calm and peaceful night. Good night.